Hello. Today I am going to teach you all a little bit about Erasmus. I was actually planning on just linking a YouTube video that someone else made on Erasmus, but it turns out there really aren't very many good ones. So here's my go at explaining the life and importance of one of the great scholars of all time, Erasmus of Rotterdam. Um, right here we've got a nice portrait of him, a worldly man of sophistication. On the book, which he's got his hands laid on, is an inscription which says the Herculean works of Erasmus of Rotterdam. So he was not modest about the amount of work that he went into, the influence he had on changing Renaissance biblical scholarship. Um, but he's a guy that you don't learn too much about now and is greatly overshadowed by Protestant figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin. And one of the things we're going to do today is talk a little bit about why that is, why a figure who was so lauded in his own time as the greatest of academics and the greatest of biblical scholars is today largely forgotten. Erasmus was born the bastard son of a priest and probably the priest like housemaid, although we're not really sure how long their relationship lasted, and what Erasmus's childhood was like. We do know that he was educated at one of the best schools in the area, and critically, this was one of the first primary schools in Northern Europe to teach Greek. As I've talked about before, the knowledge of ancient Greek was reintroduced to Western Europe in the early 15th century by Manuel Chrysoloras, a Greek who fled the Ottoman Turks to northern Italy in the first decade of the 15th century. By the time Erasmus was a kid, this knowledge was percolating into northern Europe. And it's really this knowledge of ancient Greek, which he was an exemplary student, that was going to propel him into stardom. Now, his parents died when he was a teenager, and at the age of 21, he was basically forced by circumstance to become an Augustinian priest. He had no money, he had no prospects, and a job in the priesthood would give him some stability. Now, Erasmus had many different jobs as a priest, clerical work. He was an advisor to different royal personages. But at the end of the day, he became most famous as the Michael Jordan of Renaissance biblical scholarship. And to give you an idea of just how significant he is in the contributions to the study of the Bible and biblical languages, when I was in divinity school studying ancient Greek, the system of accent marks and pronunciations that we used at Yale Divinity School was invented by Erasmus. He standardized the approach to which Western Europeans studied ancient Greek for the purposes of better understanding the New Testament. And before him, there was very rudimentary kind of strategy and formatting of how to actually go about working with this ancient language. So by 1516, Erasmus had created the first coordinated Greek and Latin New Testament. Keep in mind, before Erasmus, when people in Western Europe read the New Testament, they were only doing so in a Latin translation, usually the Vulgate, which was a product of a 5th century, late Roman work, taking the Greek originals and putting them into Latin. What Erasmus did is he went back to the oldest texts that he could find of the New Testament and created, at least for his time, a definitive Greek New Testament. What was actually written in the Gospels, because it wasn't Latin, it was Greek. And Erasmus, really brought that to the attention of the biblical scholarship community and created a digestible Greek version of the New Testament. So I'm going to read a couple excerpts from different works of Erasmus to give you an idea of why he was important, why people call him the father of Christian humanism. One of his first major books was called Handbook of a Christian Knight, which is essentially a guidebook to behavior. And I'll just go ahead and read this excerpt. For truly it is not meet, meaning good, nor convenient to declare ourselves Christian men by this proof or token if we kill very many, but rather we should save very many. Not if we send thousands of heathen people to hell, but if we make many infidels faithful. Not if we cruelly curse and excommunicate them, but if we, with devout prayers and with all our hearts, desire their health and pray unto God to send them better minds. Essentially here, Erasmus is saying a Christian man shows his strength, shows his Christianity, not by killing infidels, but by praying for their physical well-being and praying for their faithful conversion to Christianity. Now, from a modern perspective, we could say, well, why doesn't Erasmus just say we should accept them for their own religion and, everyone's equal no matter what their faith? Keep in mind, y'all, this is 500 years ago. So Erasmus's position that true Christianity is praying for your enemies is groundbreaking in some ways, ironically, because this is exactly the kind of thing that Jesus himself would have taught. And when we're talking about the impact of Erasmus on critiques of the church in his own day and of being the father of Christian humanism, a lot of it is that Erasmus is going to focus on how a Christian should act, not necessarily what rituals a Christian should perform. And we'll touch back on that in a minute. Erasmus's most notable work of satire, because Erasmus is what we today call a wit, someone who is an academic, but also a comedian, a social commentator. He did it all. He's like the Joe Rogan and the Walter Cronkite and the Jordan Peterson all rolled into one. So a couple excerpts from In Praise of Folly. And this first one is concerning scholastic academics who concern themselves only with the most obscure questions of the Christian faith. Do but observe our grim philosophers that are perpetually beating their brains on knotty subjects, and for the most part you'll find them grown old before they are scarcely young. So he's critiquing the irrelevance of a lot of contemporary scholarship to real-world issues. Scholars are boring to people not because the people are ignorant, but because the scholars are working on problems that are of little interest and consequence to ordinary folks. This next one is a critique of the priesthood. Almost all Christians being wretchedly enslaved to blindness and ignorance, which the priests are so far from preventing or removing that they blacken the darkness and promote the delusions. So keep in mind that Erasmus himself was a priest, but one of the things he condemned about the Catholic Church was that many priests were uneducated, some of them were even illiterate, and just did a bad job teaching their congregations about the actual tenets of Christianity. Because keep in mind that the congregants themselves could not read the Bible. They relied on priests, for all their access to, Christian tradition. And that the priests, instead of focusing on ethical conduct, that, in other words, the teachings of Jesus, they were focused on teaching the rituals and sacraments of the church, divorced from their biblical context. Now, probably Erasmus's definitely his most controversial work during his own time was Julius Excluded from Heaven. And this is in reference to Pope Julius II, who really was trying to create a political dynasty in central Italy. And he took on the papal name Julius in reference to Julius Caesar, hence my slip, Emperor Julius. Now, this work was so controversial that Erasmus didn't even claim authorship, although modern scholars are almost certain that it was penned by him. And Erasmus wrote some letters later in his career that suggest that he was the author of Julius Excluded. It was controversial because, as the name implies, the work suggests that the Pope is not going to end up in heaven, but is going to go to hell, and that he's going to be met with a wretched reception by St. Peter at heaven's gates. And this is a quote from the fictional Peter in the dialogue Julius Excluded. As things stand, Christianity has shrunk within narrow bounds indeed, and if you look closely, even within those bounds, you will find merely nominal Christians. Let me ask you, didn't you ever consider, when you became supreme pastor of the church, how this church was born, how it grew, what sort of men gave it strength? Was this accomplished by wars, by chests full of treasure, by cavalry raids? No, by patience under suffering, by the blood of martyrs, and our own by enduring prisons and whips. So once again, Erasmus comes to this point that the church in his day is not teaching Christianity. It's teaching a set of rituals and practices that are to the benefit of the church itself, to the benefit of the bureaucracy, but not to the benefit of the lay people, and not in keeping with the actual teachings of Jesus. In 1516, Erasmus wrote a short work called The Education of a Christian Prince, which was addressed to Prince Charles Habsburg, who would go on to become Emperor Charles V of the Habsburgs and King of Spain, the most powerful monarch in Christendom of the 16th century. And essentially what Erasmus is trying to do is explain to a young prince how one ought to behave as a ruler and also be Christian. It matches up nicely as a counter work to Machiavelli's The Prince. Now, this excerpt is interesting on Erasmus's treatment of Holy Scripture. The prince should have thorough warning that not all of the things that he reads in Holy Scriptures are to be straightaway imitated. Let him learn that the battles and the butcheries of the Hebrews and their barbarity toward their enemies are to be interpreted allegorically, otherwise it would be most disastrous to read them. So this is actually a pretty controversial point for that time, and in some ways for our time as well when it comes to biblical scholarship. This idea that there are parts of the Bible that are not to be taken literally, but are to be taken allegorically. And Erasmus is very firm on this point, that we should not imitate the genocidal actions of the biblical Hebrews that we see in books like Exodus and 2 Samuel. And finally, in 1523, Erasmus wrote Discourse on Free Will. Now this was really a response to Martin Luther. Luther, when he posted his 95 Theses in 1517, was strongly opposed to the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, was strongly opposed to the abuses of the clergy, and including indulgences and other ways in which the Catholic Church had really been predatory towards its parishioners. Now Erasmus also disagreed, or Erasmus also condemned all those aspects of the Catholic Church, yet he believed that the Catholic Church was really what held Europe together. So he did not want to break away and make a separate church like Martin Luther. He wanted to reform the church from within. Now that being said, one area in which Martin Luther and Erasmus had a severe theological disagreement was on free will. For Martin Luther, man is predestined to go to heaven or hell, and one knows if they're going to heaven or hell through their faith in God. So again and again, Luther puts emphasis on divine sovereignty, meaning divine control over the universe, and the importance of faith, whereas Erasmus wants to preserve God's justice and wants to emphasize the importance of Christian action or Christian ethics. Now that's kind of a simplification, but I think for the most part that holds true when we're talking about the differences between these two thinkers. So a couple brief excerpts from Discourse on Free Will. Who will be able to bring himself to love God with all his heart when he created hell, seething with eternal torments, in order to punish his own misdeeds and his victims, as though he took delight in human torments? What this refers to is the idea that if God predestines some people to go to heaven and hell, then why would God punish those who are in hell when they're not there for any fault of their own, other than that they're predestined by an omnipotent deity? So, Erasmus makes a pretty solid point there that, it's hard to stomach, right? When we square predestination with eternal punishment in hell. Another excerpt. There are some things which God has willed that we should contemplate as we venerate himself in mystic silence. And moreover, there are many passages in the sacred volumes, meaning the Bible, about which many commentators have made guesses, but no one has finally cleared up their obscurity. As the distinction between the divine persons, the conjunction of the divine and the human nature in Christ, the unforgivable sin, etc. Yet there are many other things which God has willed to be most plainly evident, and such are the precepts for the good life. Essentially here, Erasmus is saying we shouldn't even be arguing about these lofty theological ideas, which we're never going to find certainty about because we're not God. Instead, we should focus our attention on the aspects of the Bible that are clear, most importantly, ethical behavior. And another thing that we see here is Erasmus's doubt in his or any human's ability to really come to strong theological certainty about these kind of existential questions concerning God's being and, salvation, soteriology, who's going to be saved, who's going to be damned. And, this is one of the Erasmus's, I'm not sure if this is a direct quote of his, but it's, part of his philosophy is that he's not willing to die for his beliefs on certain theological tenets of the Christian church because he holds in his mind the possibility that he's wrong, that what he believes could be wrong, and therefore to die for a wrong belief is nonsensical. Luther, on the other hand, has a very high degree of confidence in his own faith and his own faith conclusions around big theological questions. So why is it that Erasmus is largely forgotten when Luther is so popular? Well, one, Luther went on to start his own church and was the spark, that really catalyzed the entire Protestant movement. Whereas Erasmus was kind of a man without a country. He was a man who was strongly condemnatory of many aspects of the Catholic Church, but remained a devout Catholic throughout. Also, the psychology that Erasmus is trying to support, this psychology of doubt, is not a comforting message for most people. That, hey, you really shouldn't be too confident in your own beliefs because you could be wrong. Whereas Luther really wants to democratize faith and say that each individual, answering to their own conscience, is going to discover their own truth. Now, this gets a little tricky for Luther because essentially once you open up that idea of how people find truth, it will break into infinite paths. And this is why Protestantism doesn't become one denomination, but many, 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 dozens or hundreds of different churches break from the Catholic Church over the centuries as more and more individuals come to their own unique understanding of biblical truth that is not reconcilable always with that of their neighbors, henceforth the splintering of Christendom. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and it was a little illuminating on the importance of Erasmus of Rotterdam and why, despite his importance, he is a largely unknown figure today.